It's my pleasure to introduce Geraldine Brooks, who will be interviewing Seymour Hersh tonight. Australian-born, Brooks started her career as a reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald. She went on to become a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, where she covered crises in the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. In 1990, with her husband Tony Horowitz, she won the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Coverage of the Gulf War. She turned her considerable talents to historical fiction in 2001 with the publication of her first novel, Years of Wonder. It went on to be an international bestseller and is currently optioned to be a major motion picture. Geraldine is the author of 5 novels, including March, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. So thank you, Geraldine, for being here. There are many things that investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has been called in his long 6-decade career, but for me, it's indomitable. I believe he's indomitable both in his personal life and professionally, because he worked so hard to get here. He was ready when the weather was bad. He was ready to take the Peter Pan bus to make sure that he got here tonight. Luckily, he didn't have to do that. His career has been characterized by finding the truth that often contradicts the official story. He has undertaken the hard and rare work of developing and cultivating sources over many years who are able to corroborate that the official line on national security is often incorrect. He is the conspiracy theorist who is rarely wrong. After graduating from the University of Chicago, Hersh began his career in journalism as a copy boy and a police reporter for the City News Bureau of Chicago in 1959. 4 years later, he became a correspondent for the AP. He also worked as a press secretary to the campaign of Senator Eugene McCarthy for the 1968 presidential election. And we talked about that particular election last week when we discussed playing with fire. He returned to journalism working as a Vietnam War freelancer and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting in 1970 for exposing the My Lai massacre. In 1972, he became a reporter for the New York Times, where he reported on the Watergate scandal. He wrote his first piece for the New Yorker in 1971 and has been a regular contributor to the magazine since 1993. His journalism awards include a Pulitzer Prize, 5 George Polk Awards, 2 National Magazine Awards, and more than a dozen other prizes for investigative reporting. In 2004, Hersh exposed the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in a series of pieces for The New Yorker. In 2005, he received his 5th George Polk Award, making him the award's most honored laureate. Tonight, he'll discuss his memoir, Reporter, which is an investigative journalism's tour de force. It's part how-to and part what happened. It's a delicious book to read, and I'm thrilled to have him here tonight to be able to present. Take it away.
So, Sue Ellen was probably too polite to go there, but Richard Pearl once said that you're the closest thing American journalism has to a terrorist. I would say that you're an equal opportunity offender. You've pissed off everybody. That you've been the scourge of Nixon and Kissinger and both Bushes, but also JFK and Obama. And that's how a journalist should be, really, the very model of a modern major muckraker.
Well, I can't sing, but by the way, I always ask this question, and can you all hear? Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've done speeches, mostly with people that screw are old, like this group does.
Yeah.
And be told afterwards nobody heard a thing. I didn't say anything about it. You know, it's all about if, you know, some people measure success by going to the White House for dinner. I measure success by never having been invited.
So you give a lot of excellent advice. This book should be read by every aspiring journalist, John le Carre says, and I completely agree. And one crucial piece of advice that you offer is never to start on an interview by asking the subject your core questions. So, Seymour Myron Hersh, when are you going to publish Donald Trump's tax returns?
Okay, so we get right away into stuff that the special prosecutor, so I understand, got to them very early. Why not? Well, the first thing he did was he had the right, and he did get them, and apparently, as we have seen, there wasn't enough to nail him on it. He was careful. I think we're all making, we talked about this earlier, I don't want to ruin the night, but I'm going to, I'm sure, by telling you, unless something drastic happens, he's probably going to win the next election. You tell me what the Democrats are going to do. They're running against him. They're playing in his pig pen, really, with the tweeters, whatever it's called. My children long ago, once this developed, got together and ordered me never to tweet or never to read them. And so that's, I know that, I think it's a great idea. Every time I look at them, I'm appalled by what passes for information. And we are in a crisis about information where it's not about truth anymore. It's you can say it's about feelings, and truth doesn't exist anymore. It's just that it seems to me that Hillary didn't do such a good job by spending the last 2 months running against him, and right now you have the Democrats running against him, and the major newspapers, the New York Times and Washington Post, running against him, and it works here, it works in New York, it works in California, it doesn't work anywhere else. There's tremendous, he's played the racist card very beautifully on the immigration issue, and it just works. It works in middle America, it works in a lot of places where people feel threatened, and we are a society, we don't have to get into this, but the bottom 50% have seen income go down by 1 or 2% in the last 30, 40 years. There's no growth in income, no growth in, and so you've got a country that's, you could make an argument, you've got a country that's almost on the verge of a revolution of sorts, whether it gets physical or not, or kinetic. We do have a revolution going on. We have this man pandering to a group that doesn't like the other side, and he's exasperated the dislike. And we have a Democratic Party that can't think its way out of the box. They've got to attack him for going to North Korea, which I think is counterproductive. Just doesn't make sense. And so when you're so negative so often, I don't think the leadership is reading it right. And we were just talking beforehand. The New York Times finally figured out something. They didn't know what was going on with the election in Queens, and they don't know what's going on in the party. And it's I actually thought we'd come out with 3 parties. It would break up after the last election, and it's held together. It's going to have to change. The Democratic Party is going to have to move dramatically, and I don't see this leadership doing it.
Do you think what happened in Queens is a sign of hope or something more positive?
I think it's really interesting. What's interesting is that just like the election with Trump, it wasn't seen. Nobody knew it was coming. I just happen to have a niece that was very active in that campaign, and she knew it was coming. And a lot of people in the left in New York knew it was coming. They knew it was coming. They knew something was happening with her. She was making inroads. And I'll tell you, you can't leave it to the politicians. You got to do something in the Democratic Party. It's gotta tell people why they should vote for it, instead of saying why you shouldn't like Trump. You have to change the agenda, if you will. And that's just me. Look, I don't know anything about politics. When I worked for McCarthy, I was dragooned into it by a wonderful columnist named Mary McGrory. Bobby Kennedy wouldn't run. And Mary, she lived across the street. And she was wonderful except after 2 martinis, and look out. She could unload. But I didn't know Gene McCarthy. I didn't know who he was. He was very diffident. And I've already been a journalist. I just thought he needed a press secretary. He needed people to write speeches, too. He was just winging stuff. Not that he wasn't smart, but he wasn't organized in a way that he could maximize it. And I went to hear him speak. I wasn't going to do it until I heard him speak. And the first thing he described the Vietnam War. I remember it was late '67. He described it, he said, it's immoral. And I'd never heard a politician talk about morality when it came to American killing in a war. I'd never heard it before. And I said, okay, I gotta go. This guy's gotta go. I mean, he did. And, Bobby came, and after McCarthy did well in New Hampshire, most of you know that history, probably half of you work for McCarthy. Long hair, get clean for Gene. And so I saw it happen. I saw him come from, I remember a couple of weeks into it, I thought I was really helping to screw the peace movement because we were running at 4 or 5%, but I saw it go. I saw him just go shake hands and talk to people and just talk. Talked about how they had changed what they were doing in Vietnam. They had lowered the standards, McNamara, to get more underclass, more people from the barrios, more people from the black communities, education is what a scandal, how bad education is. More people from the rural districts of America, and get away from these college kids that were being drafted because they were coming home and talking. And the way McCarthy described that, just ad lib, he said in one speech, they're changing the color of the corpses. And so you could just do it. It's there. So, Jamie Raskin's coming next month. And by the way, we guys who come in August, we like to see it rain in July. Got to tell you that.
No, we kind of jumped ahead, and I want to
Get control, kid.
I want to do this book justice. I never thought I would thank Dick Cheney for anything, but apparently we have Dick Cheney to thank for the fact that you wrote a memoir. Do you want to talk about what was going on with that?
I did a lot of work for Dave Remnick and the New Yorker, and I actually started working for William Shawn in 1970. And just to tell you what William Shawn was like, I just walked in one day. I couldn't get hired by the newspapers because I'd been in politics, even though I'd done My Lai and written my second book by then.
No, we're jumping ahead again.
Well, okay.
No, but you wrote this memoir because you were writing a book about Dick Cheney.
I did a book about Dick Cheney. I did a lot. I found people. The way it works for me in journalism is, if there's any guiding principle, it's that I'm interested in those guys who have a good career, are very bright, go in the military and the intelligence community, the State Department, and when they take the oath of office, it's to the Constitution, and not to their boss, and not to the general, and not to the president. And when you find those people, and sometimes they seek me out. I mean, they're for life, we're friends for life. And so a couple of people I knew from earlier stuff, including Vietnam, people really bright in the military and in the intelligence community. It's not as if they're always a spy, but they're brought in ad hoc. And Cheney was smart enough. He's very bright. In one meeting, he began going on about the Balfour Declaration. I mean, how many people read that? He literally went, and I just know from the few exchanges, he knew things like de Tocqueville. He knew things. He's just, even though he dropped out of Yale, I don't know what that means, not much. And he was very smart. And he wasn't crazy. So 2 of my friends became ad hoc for him in the summer when he became vice president, after George Bush, who was as incompetent as you think he was. And so his father wanted him to do it because he knew the kid was not up to the job. So Cheney took the job. And 2 months later, March or April, he brought in a couple of people he trusted and respected from his years as Secretary of Defense and his years as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and really smart in that in the 80s. They were ad hoc. They would meet a couple of times on weekends with him, and during the week a couple of times. And after 9/11, one of them got worried because he was an Islamophobic, I guess you could call it. He really hated the Muslims for what they did. He was like somebody from the Knights of Malta in the 13th century going to go after the infidels. And he also wanted to keep the necklace, that's how he put it, around Russia, which is why we built so many bases in the stanzas around him. We became their allies, the former members of the Soviet Union. And so that frightened a couple of people who began to talk to me when I was writing critically about the war, and was saying again and again, there are no bombs there, because I just knew, because you can't write without reading. And I used to read something called the Quarterly Reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the group in Vienna that monitored nuclear compliance. And there was just no question. We bombed the hell out of the stuff during the first Gulf War. Baghdad the whole nuclear complex was destroyed. And as you know, they did have a reactor that, the Israelis, remember, they bombed it in Osirik. Osirik, is that how it's pronounced? Mm-hmm. Anyway, the point of all that. So I was running inside and writing stories based on the fragments I could tell. But I was running inside because these guys were in a lot of meetings, and it was pretty scary to them. So after it was over, and the election was over, and they lost, and Obama won, I waited about another year and decided, okay, let's go and do a book on the other things I knew. I'll give you an example. The black program was run completely off the books from 3 very secret bank accounts with many billions in it he kept in 3 different countries. And that way, the notion, there was some joking. I remember people used to talk sometimes when there was a lot of debate about torture, and the government was, the Justice Department was writing all these very tortured memos saying how it's okay to torture people, until they get to the point where, I guess, till they die or whatever they did. And there was a notion then that they thought the Constitution was a nuisance. Cheney really believed the Constitution was a nuisance. And it wasn't until, anyway, I had a lot of stuff from the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, Richard Obey, who's still alive and well, who retired 2 years after Obama got him, did 30 years, and he was chairman, and he knew what was going on. And amazing stories about how he couldn't do anything about it. Here's a guy violating the Constitution, running murder houses of murder. And just to really cheer up this place, I'm Little Mary Sunshine here. At the last count, there are 76 places in the world where the United States is involved kinetically, many of them in Africa. That's the last count. That doesn't mean major stuff, but you get a glimpse when something goes wrong in Mali. What are we doing? What was the purpose? What's the goal? Saving what for what? It's just quite amazing what goes on. Anyway, Ellsberg is famous for saying this, Dan Ellsberg, the government can keep secrets. You have to keep that in mind. They can keep secrets. They do know how to do it. Anyway, so I was going to unveil some of the secrets, and Obama, in the second term, he really pissed me off no end. Not that it matters what I thought, but I thought I could understand in the first term being a trimmer, because for African American to win an election is very important. In the second term, I didn't think he did enough. He got through health care. You got to give him the due, and that took a lot of pushing and perseverance.
You said that you're hard on him because you think he's the best one we'll have in 50 years.
He's certainly going to be, I think it's very clear, he's clearly going to be the brightest one. You could, I guess Lincoln and Kennedy were very, very bright, but the rest are pretty ordinary, and he was clearly extremely bright. And, still is, obviously. But I thought he needed to do more. They still had Tuesday meetings when they discussed the kill meetings, and they didn't really change the paradigm, to use that word. And so anyway, I took what I had, and in the years of working on Cheney, I did know about the surveillance that was going on, and I put nothing in a computer. In my office, there's a picture. New York Times ran a photograph of my office, and you saw all these huge piles of, they were handwritten interviews, and then I'd have to go and index them. Some guys I saw 300-400 times in the 8 years of Cheney, 500 times. I'd have to index them. I had, in doing this, some of the people, give you ideas, some people in the government are amazingly interesting and bright, and they stay in because their mother and father, their father was an admiral, their father was and I had one Navy wife. I'd been seeing somebody early in the morning. I began doing it late '01, but by '05 or '06, his wife knew me pretty well. Every 3 weeks or so, I'd go and we'd just take copious notes. And one morning she came out and gave me, it was coffee, something like that. And she said, "Oh, Cy," she said, "you'll never understand Cheney unless you read all of Freud, Shakespeare, and the Greeks." So I followed her into the kitchen. This anonymous Navy wife, her husband was an admiral, and I followed her into retired. And I said, "Well, tell me who you are. Where'd you go?" And she'd obviously she'd gone to Smith and then gone to another great university to get a master's degree. And it's just hard to judge people. So I started giving them chapters about 14 or 15, and at this time Obama was being very tough. He was putting, there was a CIA officer he prosecuted for reasons that were very, people talked to reporters and there was no sign, no damage. It was just arbitrary. And there was some people prosecuted in camera who worked in the government, which was terrible. Prosecuted somebody and sent him away for, without really any public. It was just an amazing story. So there was a lot of bad stuff going on. And these guys were smart enough to know that the stuff I had I couldn't get away with it. I was going to write about the signal intelligence community and the line that goes on there. There's something called the FISA warrant. It's designed for it's foreign intelligence. And the idea was you had a court that was set up. It was done by rotation. The judges were rotated off to district courts usually. I don't think from the appellate courts. They were district court judges. Washington has its group from all over. About 17 altogether and it's a complicated thing because the law on SIGINT is very deep. There's been a lot of legalities, a lot of adjustments and amendments. Anyway, the whole idea of the SIGINT program is that if you have reason to suspect somebody and you need it, before you can do anything to an American citizen, even if he's caught listening, talking to somebody overseas, any American citizen you had to get a warrant for. There's some overriding. They've changed the law quite a bit, and they've modified it so that there's a back doorway. But this is throughout the 80s and 90s. It came as a result of the church hearings, which came off a story I wrote about domestic spying for the Times. So I was always tuned into it. And it turns out, of course, the way it works in the SIGINT community is you listen. If it's a close case, you listen before you get the warrant. So when you get the warrant, you'll get it. So that's what they do. It's just there's a word for it. There's a phrase for it, pre-warrant listening or something. Just complete casual abuse of something we have no idea goes on. When you give that much power to anybody, it's always absorbed. So I was doing that kind of stuff, and the guy said no. And the obligation, so the guy that runs Ganaf, Sunny Mehta, who some of you have read about, he's really an amazing, wise man. And I went and I said, "Well, which one of my children do you want?" I was into him for about $800,000 or so. I've been working for him for 4 years. And he said, "Do a memoir," and that's why I did it. And guess what?
So here we have the memoir, and it's very interesting. Your early life, your family was apolitical. They were
Apolitical, yes, apolitical. Immigrants. The first language was Yiddish, basically. And my father was from Lithuania, my mother from Poland. And my father came to America after World War I. There were purges and horrible stuff going on in both in Poland and Lithuania constantly. And it was a hardscrabble life. No education. They had no real American education. I don't think either one graduated. And it was just, my father got cancer when I was bad cancer when he was 15. It took him over 18 months. And I was the least frightened of him among my peers in the family. I don't know why, but I was the least frightened. But we were all pretty scared of my father. And my mother communicated by cooking. So, you all know that thing. That's a very common gestalt, That's how she communicated. So everything you did was self-starting. So as you know, when I was 13, I joined the Book of the Month Club, which was a big deal back then, 99 cents or $1, and I would always get every month the nonfiction. And a lot of times it was J. Edgar, the head of the FBI, Hoover, writing about communism, or John Gunther writing about communism. But there were great books on Chinese history and the Habsburg monarchy. I remember loving that stuff. So you got a lot of other stuff you're just reading. School was sort of school. And so I learned then about reading. And so if anything I learned in my life as a journalist is you read before you write.
And you read a lot of boring stuff.
I'm reading a book right now that's everybody would call, it's going to be published in a couple of months by a political economist from the University of London. It's a book about why we don't have truth anymore, why truth has disappeared. And it's a book very interesting because he goes to the great scholars, intellectual scholars of our time. Hobbes, goes back to Hobbes. But let me just...
You advocate reading really things that bore you because...
It's not boring, it's just, it's difficult.
Unsung reports are boring. And yet you have to read, and then you find hiding in plain sight the secrets and the leads that you need.
It's just about most of the major advances in science and medicine and the idea of censuses and the idea of raising taxes. I'm talking about back 16th, 17th, 18th century. The idea of having a formal structure. The function was to make war more accessible. So you begin to get an understanding from reading that. And then with the advent of Twitter and what's the word when something goes going viral. We were just talking about it today at Buck and Kay's house, Goldstein. Their daughter had done something with it. It's so fast. And I see it in the New York Times, what happens in the New York Times, because they're in such a hurry, because everything's on CNN and MSNBC, and no matter how much Trump lies, anything they say is immediately flashed as breaking news, whether it's true or not. There's no assessment. And so you get to the point where the paper, it does a lot of good stuff. My old newspaper still does a lot of good stuff on social issues. When it comes to hardcore national security issue, where it takes months maybe to get something, and then you throw it away, you can't do it, they write tips. I see stories in which it's an argument. It's no longer, one country says this, one country says that. Well, go and find out. Is there another side to the Ukraine story? I think there is. I think American, as awful as that guy, I think there was a lot of provocation we made before the trouble started there. We were doing things there. That's a me responsible.
So I cannot keep you in
All right.
the dry cleaner shop.
Just tell me to shut up. Say shut up, and I'll shut up.
We might as well jump right into it because we're going there anyway. So what are the three biggest mistakes in foreign policy that we're making right now?
The three biggest mistakes we're making right now?
In foreign policy.
Well, I don't know how many three means, but...
Well, let's just...
the
Can
list...
we start with my favorite, my personal
I would say the 3 million foreign policy mistakes. I'll just give you an example. A train in 2004, a group of crazies in Spain trigger a train crash. They wire up a train. They seize a train, a commuter train in the morning, one of those fast trains that we don't have in America. And they plow into the station in Madrid, and they kill remember that, 650? And so this is 3 years after 9/11. It's a trauma for them. If you compare the population of America with the population of Spain, it's much greater. The death rate was much greater, and they treat it like a crime. And they investigate it, and they find the guys that did it, and they put them in jail, and they move on. Because, and this is where you get into, Cheney had a different reason, I think, than Bush. I just don't know much about Bush. I know more about Cheney. People would talk to me about meetings with Cheney, but they didn't want to talk about meetings with the president. I'm talking about guys who, they felt a loyalty, even though they hated what was going on. So it's harder to get stuff. So what we do is we decide the politics of are pretty good. You've been going nowhere. He's been a pretty feckless, useless sort of president, sort of dumb, and going on. Nothing much has happened. And here comes this thing in September, and he goes to Yankee Stadium, and he's a hero. Remember, he throws out the first baseball, and he's being treated like a grown-up for the first time, really. I mean, it's just that the anecdotal stories about the guy are just beyond belief. Everybody comes in, he doesn't know, he shows them the rug. Do you like it? My wife thought the color was too much. I mean, that kind of conversation. I hear that from more than one person. It's really strange stuff. Anyway, I never met him. I met Cheney. Anyway, and so we begin a war against an idea, terrorism, which is in itself crazy. I mean, what are the causes of terrorism? You're not going to beat it with guns. And we attack the Taliban, who are completely off the wall, mistreatment of women, mistreatment of opposition, ruthless in a way, but no interest in foreign adventures. And in fact, in the summer of 2001, both Henry Kissinger and Al Haig, the number 1 and 2 in those Nixon years, at the National Security Council, both were taking great sources of money from various countries trying to build a pipeline through Afghanistan. Argentine Brightus was the one I think Kissinger took money for and was lobbying, and Haig was doing it for another company, an American company. And they were all trying to get a pipeline. They're mercantile. They had nothing to do with bin Laden. He was a guest, and I will tell you, I'm also was going to write this in detail. I'm amazed nobody knows this, but as you know, many people know, because I'm sure in this audience know, and the great idea, Jimmy Carter's overwhelming idea, the one that'll stick for history, was a decision when there was trouble in Afghanistan, civil war, was with the pushing of Brzezinski, who otherwise was very good in other stuff later, just like Kissinger has been much better in other stuff later. Brzezinski wanted to give Russia its own Vietnam, so we began working with bin Laden and other crazy radical groups in 79 and 80, and they worked closely with the CIA. Somebody tell me the name of the group in Algeria. There was 5 years of total hell. I can't remember the name, but the whole Algerian revolution, the leadership cut its teeth in, it's really not, it's a fact that's known, but nobody pays enough attention to it. Algeria blew up in the middle 80s. It was just went 5-6 years. What was the name of that group? And it doesn't matter. But the leaders of that group got their teeth, got wetted in this whole idea of terrorism and how effective it can be, because they were involved with bin Laden. They were recruited from all over bad places where they had a lot of internal trouble. They all came there. And the CIA station, the guy who ran the program, won't let me use his name, but he was really upset about what happened. In a way, it got out of control. And anyway, we did what we did, and bin Laden did what he did, went on. 9/11 happened, and after 9/11, many members of the Taliban who had been working also against the regime, it was the Russian regime in the beginning, probably the best government in the 10 years before, the 10 years before Carter and Brzezinski got in there was a Russian government. It's sort of interesting, but we'll talk about Russia later if you want. There you go. Anyway, the bottom line is, they began calling their CIA guys, the guys that worked with them after 9/11. And the message was, and they gave it to senior people in the CIA, and we're talking about 1980 when these guys were still in the CIA. They were heroes for what they did. They gave the Russians a heartache. If you remember, the Russians retreated from Afghanistan, and there were later wonderful books, wonderful internal memos of Politburo that were made public. They resealed them, but a bunch of academics got it. And it showed there was just intense angst inside Russia about what a screw-up they'd made, just like we had with Vietnam. Anyway, the Taliban message was, I'll tell you literally what it was. I heard this in 3 or 4 guys. Once I learned one was called, I knew others had. This is all stuff I learned in the Cheney years. The message was, in Pashtun society, which is the dominant ethic, in Pakistan, a lot of Pashtuns, and also in Afghanistan, the guest is the most important thing. As any of you know, if you travel in Africa or in the Middle East, you're always given the best food, and no matter how poor the family is. So the guest is the most important thing, and he's always allowed a certain amount of leeway. And they called to say, he's not our guest anymore. You know where he is, go kill him. And we didn't do that. Instead, we started a war against the Taliban. And after 3 months, we got bored with that. We couldn't find bin Laden. Bin Laden escaped into the mountains. It's very tough mountain areas, the Tora Bora Mountains, they're called. There's places there that basically inhabitable, can't be inhabited. Habitated. That's a hard word to say. Anyway, for me anyway. He got away, and so we turned our attention to what they really wanted to do, the neocons, which is to take out Saddam, because theoretically he had nukes which posed a threat to us. In our plan, the plan was, and I was going to write about this, they were all going to go down. We're going to make the world safe in the Middle East for Israel. That was the neocon plan. And I actually have it in writing. I have an attack plan in writing that somebody in the CIA gave me in '02, a station chief in another country. And it was so, I have all this stuff, and so I couldn't do it because even saying what I just said about a station chief, that could lead to who he could be, because I just was worried about getting somebody burned. And so I did the memoir, and it was, I have to tell you, turns out it's a lot of fun to write about yourself. I had to spend 6 months reading everything. I remember things that happened, but I don't remember what I wrote. I remember, when I got to it, there were things, I would always go, and anybody who was still alive, I would check, and my memory of what happened with people who were alive about an event was very close, but what I wrote, I didn't remember anything. Do you find that? Do you remember things you wrote about? Is that?
I'm always surprised when I go that far and how many stories I've forgotten. But you had to work in your family business after your dad died, and
I had to run it.
Yeah, and it was in the ghetto, and that made you very aware of racism in Chicago. And would you say that was formative in the way you went when you became a journalist?
It was a black ghetto business in Chicago, and I'm 15, I'm pushed, my father's got cancer, and I have older sisters who are gone. I had a brother he's a physicist. He was, at 15, he was into cybernetics, so he was never going to, I was different. I was more into the world. I mean, he's a great guy. I mean, I like him a lot. He just the idea of him running that store was comical, but I could do it. And you have to understand the fear that when your father's dying and you have a business, you can't think outside the box, and my mother did not. I got mad at my sisters when I began to do this book, because I said, what the hell were they doing? Could have sold the book, and would have been sold the store rather, and we had some money, not a lot, but I could have worked my way through school. I was a good student. I was going to go somewhere, but instead we hung onto that business. My mother was afraid not to let it go for the next 6 years. I made a deal with my brother. He left and went downstate to the University of Illinois to study actually mathematics and engineering. And state schools are great. He did fine. He got you couldn't get a doctorate in California in fluid wave theory in the last 15 years without him. And anyway, so he did fine. But so I did it. I was doing the store, and just disappeared from school, which got a lot of teachers angry at me. But I got close to there were African-American people working for us. There's a wonderful guy, and Chicago then was Chicago. It was on the south side, and Negro baseball was a big thing. I loved sports, loved to play sports as much as I could. And all kids, either that, did something like that. And there was a guy that pressed pants. There was a young guy for 12 cents a pair, right? And he was paid by the piece. We had people pressing stuff. It was a business. Wasn't fanatic, wasn't huge, but it was a store, and with Negro employees. And on every other Sunday, when the Chicago White Sox were on the road, Negro baseball was played. This is in right after World War II, and there were 40,000 people most of them African Americans, but a lot of white people going to these games because, I saw all those great, I saw all the great black players in their heyday. And so I got to know this guy as a young guy, 4 or 5 years older than me, and his life he was bright, articulate, didn't want to press pants, but his life was so prescribed. We're talking about the early 50s in Chicago. His life was so prescribed, so I got an insight. I knew I was going to go somewhere. He knew he wasn't. Do you know what I mean? And I felt that. And I also ran into Mahalia Jackson, which was very informative, because she was somebody who could go to Europe and they just knock out. Not so here. She couldn't make it across the border for many years here. So it was interesting to see that. I used to go have lunch with her. So I got empathetic about it. And that's why I fell in love when I got to Chicago for the cover of Chicago for the Associated Press. I was assigned to civil rights, and Martin Luther King owned me. He'd just give me a little wink and like that, and I was, yes sir, what do you want? Because I saw what he was doing.
Well, we're going to open up to questions from the audience, but I want to...
Is there some rock and roll club I don't know about here tonight? You're all going to go?
Before we do that, I just would love to give a sense of, you were doing incredibly solid work at the Pentagon, the AP, not doing stenography journalism for quite a long time when that was very unusual, but then the Millet story really was the turning point in your career, and you give such a fantastic and granular description about what it took as a young reporter to get that story. And I was just wondering if you'd read a few paragraphs about chasing after Lieutenant Calley. You managed to find out the name, and you managed to find out where he is, and then you have to convince him to talk.
The thing about this is, many here remember Lou Cowan, who lived here for many years. His son Jeff was the one who tipped me off about it. In '69, I got a call. What happened to me at the AP was I basically was driven off the job because I was writing critically about the lying that was going on by McNamara, who I considered to be a psychotic liar. I really couldn't believe him. He really bothered me. He really was troublesome. And he's just lying about everything. And I was talking to GIs, the same people knew I was trying to write something different. That's how I.F. Stone, I got to be his friend, because he saw me writing stuff and called up one morning at 6 o'clock to ask if I'd seen page 19 of the Philadelphia Bulletin that day. Sunday morning, he got the papers at 6 and he started reading them. My wife and I go into bed at 3. We were just married, we're partying. All right. So I get this tip about some GI that Jeff Cowan had heard, and I do know, we have all agreed, I can't say, he learned from somebody who knew something. There were some mistakes in as he translated it. I think they were probably made by him in transliteration, but that happens. He assumed it was an officer. A GI went crazy and killed 75 people in Vietnam. And this is in '69. At that time, we didn't know. We knew there were bad things, but we really didn't have it in a granular way. And I had been reading. I've been going nuts about Vietnam from '61, and just as a kid, I was reading the New York Times, and I was reading some of the French. The French had John Leclerc. They had some wonderful journalists who were covering the war too, and I knew enough to read enough. I couldn't speak it, but I could read enough with the dictionary. And I also read all of the church groups by '65 were writing critical stuff about the war that nobody paid attention to in the mainstream press, and the Russell Tribunal. Bertrand Russell Tribunal, which was mocked horribly by the New York Times. It's crazy old addled man who hated Vietnam, hated America. And in the tribunal proceedings that was given to me by one of the players, came back and came to my office and gave me one of the volumes, one of the people who were there. And in it was an account of what happened. The first troops went in '65. I know lying is bad, and this guy lies, but let me tell you what Johnson did. Johnson spent 5 months in '65 telling us there were no Americans there when there were Americans there. I don't know what you call a lie, but that was something. And anyway, in the tribunal, a GI who testifies, who I found later, He lived he was alive and well I don't know how he got to the tribunal, which was in London and other places. He was in Cleveland, near Cleveland. And so anyway, he described how they would early on and get into villages, and the way they saw it is the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists, but most of them were nationalists. In fact, just to show you how tough the world is, North Vietnam, the communists in North Vietnam killed many of the leaders of the Viet Cong because they were not communists after the war. In 75, when they took over, they assassinated many of them because they were not interested in having a communist South. And they had fought the war as nationalists. We call them Cong for communists because I and Tony Lewis and Gloria Emerson tried like hell to get the New York Times to change that, but we lost that fight. They kept on calling them, we said call them the nationalists. Anyway, the upshot is that this kid wrote in the Russell Tribunal, his testimony was that they would go and the reason they couldn't find the guerrillas that were killing him, piecemeal, shooting them off, dropping, they would fall in the pits and land in a bungee stick with poison or get shot at random by a sniper. They couldn't find them because they were farmers by day and guerrillas at night. So they decided to go early in the morning to villages and hunt out the guys. And so they would go into villages on missions. He's describing this when they first got to the country, and go into villages and not find anybody, no men. They didn't know, so they were frustrated. And after a certain point in this particular unit, it was a company, they had a tank or two and they had machine guns. The officer would say, okay guys, you can have a mad moment. And then you have to open up on the hooches and the homes of the people they'd just been to. This is in 65, not reported. And so I thought that's what we were talking about. And so the whole time I'm doing the My Lai story from the beginning, I'm thinking it was some shoot-up or a bomb went the wrong place. I have no idea they massacred 550 people, raping, the army disappeared the rapes from everything. The raping was incessant in front of the family, young girls, old girls, babies thrown up in the air and caught on bayonets. It was, oh man, believe me, I spared the public a lot of stuff. So I didn't know that. When I'm chasing Cali, I didn't know. I just knew Cali was the guy. They couldn't get him. They wanted him to plead to a misdemeanor manslaughter charge. The only guy that got prosecuted was Cali. What I didn't do, because I was at the New York Times by 72 when they began the charge. This is in 69. I'm at the New York Times and doing a lot of stuff on the war. The Times hired me because Abe Rosenthal knew they weren't doing the war right from Washington. I was making whoopee, I guess you can call it, in Washington, having a ball writing about the war. I remember how bad it was. And so I let My Lai go. The Army had 34 people charged by various investigations. Many of them were enlisted men who I knew by name. I'd seen 55 of the 89, 90 guys that were there. I knew the bad ones. The bad ones, only one bad one saw me. Most of the bad ones had their father. When I would knock on doors, that's what I was doing for 6 months, going to doors. Had the father tell me to get the hell away. A couple of the really bad guys, what they did immediately is they gave them honorable discharges and got them out. No prosecution. It's amazing what they did. And I didn't realize the extent to which 3 generals dismissed most of the charges before they even got to a hearing. So of the 34 people, only poor hapless Lieutenant Cali served 3 months for killing, you name it. All right, so I'm looking for Cali. I found the story. I find, by serendipity, there's a guy named Cali. I find his lawyer. I go see his lawyer, who was a Mormon, then Mormon elder. He retired as a judge on the Court of Military Appeals. And I always remember the great line that military justice is the justice, as military music is the music. So I kept that in mind as I went out there. Anyway, and he ended up, it doesn't matter. Cali was the guy I had to find, and I was pretty sure he came into Fort Benning. That's where the only investigation, the only thing about Cali was there was an article in the paper saying he was 2 months earlier, saying that a guy named William L. Cali Jr. from Florida was being held for investigation for the unnecessary deaths of civilians in Vietnam, or non-combatants. And when you called the base and asked, they said, some guy went crazy and shot up a gin mill, over a fight over a prostitute in a bar in Saigon. That's what they were told to say. And so I kept on going on it, and eventually I got to the lawyer. I got the lawyer's name, and the lawyer was in Salt Lake, and I flew out and talked to the lawyer. And anyway, I knew Kelly. The lawyer left me with the impression, he wouldn't say it, that he was still at Fort Benning. So I thought I'd go to I'd been in the Army, gone in the Army. I hated law school. Got out of law school and had to go in the draft, so I joined the Army instead, instead of being drafted. Anyway, so I understood the Army a little bit. And I knew that it's like all armies. If Callie were there, there was going to be someplace I'll find him, so I thought. So I get there and I'm looking. And so the first thing I did is, and this is what you want me to start reading, well, you have to.
You can tell why editors have a problem with this. Just read.
I will tell you this. Remnick once changed something. The deadline for the New Yorker was Friday night at midnight, and after that the presses go and it costs a fortune to change type. And Bremlick, I had done some story, it was complicated, and the last take I got about an hour before deadline included a paragraph he added after we'd gone through editing, just added the last minute a paragraph saying what this story means, and I hate that stuff. The story either says what it means or it doesn't, so I started screaming at him, and I said, you got to take it out. And then I said, okay, I'm not doing any more, goodbye, and that kind of stuff, And so he called me, and I have an office, a little hideaway. And I let it ring once, and he rang, and he said, Cy, I know you're there, pick it up. And 10 minutes later, Cy, I know you're there. And the third time he called, he said, Cy, he said, I've saved all your emails. And that made me say, okay. Nobody wants to see some of the emails I used to write. Didn't like editors. Anyway, so I'm looking for Callie. I'm trying to find him. He's on a base. I go to a couple of main offices, with the legal office and another office, there's an office there, a lot of officers are coming, 69. We had 500 people in the war, and people were coming back for retraining and being resent. Officers were coming back after a year in the war. I went to all the places where they'd be listed by name, and I couldn't find him. So I knew he was being held for trial, and I figured maybe he was in a jail. And Fort Benning's huge. It's as big as all of New York City, all five, whatever they call them, boroughs. A little bigger, actually. And in that area were five different main areas, with each having what they call a jail, basically. They call them something else. Brig. Somebody knows something about the war. And anyway, so here's what she wants you to read. I'll read it fast. I got a good map, so I'm going to go. I figured he's in a base. It isn't a lockup. I got a good map of the base and began driving. The routine was the same at each of the prisons I visited. Semicolon. Colon. I parked my rental car in the spot reserved for the senior officer in charge, which was invariably empty, walked into the prison in my suit and tie, carrying a briefcase, and said to the corporal or sergeant in charge in a brassy voice, I'm looking for Bill Callie. Bring him out right away. There was no Bill Callie anywhere. It took hours and more than 100 miles to navigate just a few of the stockades scattered around the fort, and I was beginning to feel the pressure of time. It was just past noon by the time I returned to the main post, and I'd gone all night because I'd flown from Salt Lake or something via Chicago. I don't know, I was up all night. I found a payphone and a base telephone directory and a post exchange, they call them PXs, cafeteria, and began calling every club I could find. Swimming, tennis, hunting, fishing, hiking. No member by the name of Callie. None of the gas stations I reached on the base had serviced the car owned by Lieutenant Bill Callie. I even checked the directory of officers at Infantry Hall, the office that handled all the training needs on the base, whose primary mission at the time was to produce infantry officers for the Vietnam War. No Callie booked in any of the Army hotels or quarters for junior officers on temporary assignment at Fort Benning. After a frustrating more than a few hours, I still had no clue to Callie's whereabouts, nor did I know if he was still at Benning. I knew he'd come back there to be prosecuted. I knew he was going through a procedure. He hadn't been charged yet. I was hungry, running out of daylight, and more than a little anxious. I decided to take a short walk and a huge risk by stopping at the main office of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, whose lawyers would be prosecuting the case against Callie if we were on the base. It was long after lunch hour, but the office was still empty except for a lone sergeant. He could not have been more friendly as I introduced myself as a journalist from Washington and said I needed some help. His smile disappeared when I said I was looking for Callie. He asked me to wait a moment, and I asked why. He said he was under orders that if anyone asked about Callie, he was to call the colonel right away. That was enough for me, and I told the sergeant not to worry about it, began walking away. The sergeant got frantic and told me I could not leave. With that, I began running out of the office and down the street, going harder with each stride. I did not want the colonel kicking me off the base. I'm going to add 2 lines you cut out. The sergeant chased me after a few dozen yards and stopped. It was a scene out of a very bad Marx Brothers movie. So I
want to give everybody a chance. I'm sure a lot of people have questions. So.
I'm sure you have one more.
Oh, I've got
I cheated you so badly. You did so much homework. I saw your notes. I was told in advance that you were going to read every line carefully. I'm sure you did, right?
That is true.
Oh, all the time you wasted.
The lady over there.
Yes. Are we going to do mics, or should I repeat the question? If the truth is...
If the truth is subjective, and 42% of America believes in one truth, and we believe in another truth, where do you find the truth?
I don't think I do always. You know, I find different opinions. The worst thing is to say that I learned with Cheney, I learned that sometimes even documents that are signed, sealed, and delivered, top secret, you know, do not deliver to anybody, don't have truth. And so, again, I'm interested in people who write about perceptions and feelings and belief. And this particular economist described a scene in the London airport, in the London train station, where there was a rumor that there had been a bomb went off, and it set off a panic. And of course, there had been no bomb. And just describing how truth doesn't emerge, you know, that how people just grab on fear, basically. You know, people do things, people do collective stuff. That's what Hobbes was writing about, out of a sense of being safe. They want to be safe collectively. And so it's very complicated now, because you have a president for which, you know, he's capable of giving a 20-minute interview and then denying said something he said 10 minutes earlier. On the other hand, I don't mind trying to end the impasse in Korea. I will tell you why I think he's doing it as much as to end the impasse, because I don't think he's interested very much. He doesn't read. He's certainly not stupid. Don't make that mistake. I mean, again, you could say simply, you know, the old cliche, would you buy a used car from a real estate salesman? Well, you wouldn't. But this is a guy that took down 15 Republicans. I looked it up, with 300 years of political experience and 2 dynasties, the Clintons and the Bushes, and began tweeting and found an audience right away. He's got 53 million people on his tweets, and they resonate, and he drives the press crazy because they live off him, and the cable television lives off the tweets. And so before the incident on the border, about which I'm sure he knew nothing because he doesn't know much about what's going on, I'm sure he learned after, when it happened. I know that my wife was sending money weeks earlier and going nuts about taking kids away from children, because anybody she's in the therapy business, anybody knows how crazy that is. But I don't, you know, I know something about, I have somebody who knows something about what goes on there on foreign policy stuff. But it turns out there's not 26,000 troops in South Korea, there's 250,000. There's a big backup. The 26,000 are combat troops very close to the demarcation line, 38th parallel, who would be immediately attacked if we started a war. They would be dead in minutes. I mean, not from a nuclear bomb, but just from rockets. They'd be impossible to exist. But the backup is 250,000, including a 4-star and a bunch of 3-stars. The Army's going to fight for those forever. So he wants to get rid of that, because he probably, my heuristic thought, it's a little more than heuristic. He's building a kitty. It's going to be a huge kitty. And one of the things you can do, if you can get rid of foreign troops, you have more money for the kitty. And it's going to probably be announced after the election of this fall. And it's going to be a kitty for infrastructure. And it's going to be enough to put millions back to work on the stuff that needs to be done, including the military people he wants to get rid of, get them out of the service because we're bloated. So if this is so, and this is what I've heard from somebody as reasonable as anybody can be in that area, I know people on the foreign policy side to whom he does defer a little bit. And so you could make the same for, it's a little scary because he's being underestimated. You just look what he did politically and how he did it and what he did to do it and how he played the race cards on immigration to the fare thee well all the way, which endeared him to white middle America. And so you have, they lost Iowa by 8 and Ohio by 10. That's a lot to lose for the Democrats because the white middle class went with him. You know, he plays on prejudice. And unfortunately, it doesn't work here and it doesn't work in New York. As I said earlier, it plays. It plays around the world. I don't know what he did I don't know how he managed to win the elections in Michigan, but if you remember, the guy from Vermont. Yeah, well, I know people that tried to talk foreign policy to him, and he had it going, but he goes to New York and doesn't know anything about bank law and Hillary rips him up appropriately. He doesn't know much about foreign policy. And the people I know that would be sent up to Vermont, I mean, serious people to talk about foreign policy in a rational way. After 5 minutes, they say he'd be doing this with his shoelaces. He didn't learn it. I was really mad at hell for him for not learning it. I worked with him on a couple of stuff. He's impossible to get along with, but he's not dumb. He's very smart. He's got he's got a wife that you could die for. I mean, kill for, or that is kill or die or whatever it is. You get the drift. And so this guy's a one-note Johnny. And if he can put people back to work, and the Democrats are just, I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get why they're so feckless. I don't get it why they don't start talking to the working class again. I don't get it why they think a cute slogan is good enough for policy. They still come up with slogans. They're really into slogans. I don't get why Obama intervened, and instead of picking the guy, the guy from Minnesota who had been a Muslim once, but was a very good senator, a very good member of the House, was a Muslim. So what if he's a Muslim? That doesn't mean he's a terrorist. Instead, he intervened to pick the guy they have now who's done nothing. I don't know why he intervened that way to keep the party centralized. I don't know why he let Hillary run the party and bleed it off 90% of its money in the 2016 election, with left everybody in the state house open for loss. And so, I don't know why. And so I don't know I don't see any leadership in the party, which is why I guess you ought to go watch Jamie Raskin when he comes here next month. Well, yeah, he's smart. Known him since he was, what? What about Russia? Wait, well, let's do it again. What do you want to know? Well, she's got to do it on the mic, otherwise I have to repeat the question. It's right. Stand up, there you go.
What do you think about the Mueller investigation being a way out of this administration? Do you think that Putin interfered and the Russians interfered in the election, or is that, and what do you think about the reports of the intelligence community?
Yeah, I know, I got the question. Okay. First of all, I hate to say this, but it doesn't really matter what I think or anybody else thinks. And I can tell you, it's been a long time since I watched one of those panels on the talk shows where they have a panel of journalists and guys who were in the Democratic Republican Party and others. And the questions asked, and every answer, it begins with the two most deadly words in the English language, I think. Got all these people talk about what they think. I think the White House is doing this. All right. I'll tell you what I know, and I think I know. I'm moving it up an inch. I've learned that when the government says, as they did from, I'd say, the last month of December 2001 until April 2003 when we bombed Iraq, and they said we have high confidence that he has weapons of mass destruction. I got it in the New Yorker. Maybe I did 12, 15 articles a year in those times. I was going nuts. I always got a line saying there's no evidence whatsoever that they have weapons of mass destruction. All right, I used to fight with Remnick. He would say, although it's a possibility, whatever it is. But we always said it because there was no evidence. And of course, there was no evidence. And so when the government says we have high confidence that Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee, I worried about that. And I do know people. And I will tell you it's a much more complicated story. What Russia was involved in goes back to Libya and Hillary in 2011 and 2012. And the only thing I can tell you is in her testimony, the woman that was, that guy S-T-R-Z-O-K, Peter, how do you pronounce it? Strosh? I've heard it 5 different ways, so I just don't bother to pronounce it. So it's S-T-R-Z-O-K is the way I pronounce it. Anyway, his girlfriend, the one that he was talking to, if you remember last week, she testified in camera before the House, one of the various, by the way, the notion of oversight of the Intelligence Committee that used to be between the House and that's gone. There's no longer, they are at each other's throats. You can't give any of them any secrets anymore because they're so busy killing each other, the Democrats and Republicans. So there's no oversight, which is a huge loss. That was one of the things that came out of the Church Committee, was 2 intelligence committees that for a long time, when people like Bradley ran it and Gary Hart, they were very good committees. And they actually did a lot of good. Anyway, she said the Chinese did it. This will come out. It'll be leaked to the press. But I'm told very reliably that she testified that we have reason to believe the Chinese did it. One of the great myths of our time is that somehow we're under great threat of cyber war. We are aces in cyber war. We are aces. We're as good as they get. We're probably, in terms of analyzing, handling, and collecting and analyzing intelligence, we're one. My friends who know a lot about it but the Brits is 2. GCHQ, the Brits have been doing it. French is 3. They think the Russians not even in the top 10 because their paranoia is so acute. It makes them skewer a lot of their intelligence. And so they only talk about high confidence and assurances. They've never said they know, which is interesting to me because we do, of course we do, and we're experts in malware. We tell the major corporations all the time, the NSA is telling them when somebody's trying to beat into them. There's constant efforts to tap into everything. Everybody wants to spy into everything. And this was unencrypted. The email that was taken by allegedly, the stories, Guccifer 2, July, and all that stuff, that all began in July. And allegedly, it was an unencrypted. It was open for anybody. It just was there. If I had a bet, I would say, if they're not saying it, they don't have it. That doesn't mean Russia didn't do something, but they don't have it. And in fact, they may have information to the contrary, which makes all of this a little crazy. I'll give you another example of what goes on. You've had the 12 GRU guys arrested. I will tell you that stems off a story that was made public a year and a half earlier by The Intercept. Some of you ever read The Intercept? A year and a half earlier, they had published an NSA document about 12 Russians that were spying on American. That was, and the document, they made it public, and the young woman, an NSA contractor, her name was Winters, somebody, what is it? Reality Winter was prosecuted for leaking it. Go back and look at it. It's this case they described 2 weeks ago. It's the same case exactly. Only in that internal document, it was much more of a hypothetical than in the one that was made public the other week. In other words, they just released some of the hypotheticals. And for me, the interesting case is, do you remember the 13 trolls they announced that they were going to indict about 6 months ago? Trolls, the 13 trolls that were running stuff, pictures of Hillary as a witch and stuff like that, which weren't so hard to find on the internet, not necessarily from trolls. There's a lot of negative stuff about her. And there was a Russian company they all worked for, that they indicted the company and the 13 trolls. Well, the company did something that astonished Mueller's people, who gave the indictment. It was a big indictment. They haven't been doing much. It was a good one. It got us away from the Manafort and the Page. All that stuff they were talking about was much earlier. Manafort's charged with a violation of the it's an act to the register of foreign agent registration that's been totally ignored by everybody. They've only brought 9 cases in the history of the law because nobody registers. They all know that you don't have to. And one case, there was a fine given. So I don't know what they're going to do with Manafort. They might convict him on it. They might not. I know his lawyer, one of his lawyers well. He's a good guy. Doesn't think they'll get him on it, but it doesn't matter. It has nothing to do, it's early stuff. And he certainly was on there, a bum, passing money, all that stuff he was doing. But, that's business as usual, I guess, for a lot of people. Anyway, the company, the Russian company that sponsored him, you had stories about this company. Kids talked about working there. They hired people off the street, Russian. They came into court and accepted jurisdiction. And the first thing they did is they hired a very smart Washington lawyer, guy with been the U.S. attorneys are really smart, bright, tough guy. First thing they did is they said, okay, give us your evidence. I'm here. I'm going to accept jurisdiction. And the government then, Mueller's people then went in and said, well, we need a delay, and they got a delay, and the judge said, well, just if you got the evidence, come on, Mueller's people said, we'll do it in camera, and the judge said, what are you talking about? You're prosecuting, indicted him in the open. It's America. You can do it. If you got the evidence, show us what the evidence is. Well, it's highly classified. Well, we'll have a meeting and we'll take out the stuff that's secret, how you collected it. We don't have to give that stuff. Know how much stuff about how they gave was in the recent indictment. All this details about their keystrokes they were using. You don't do that in the business. You don't do that. If you really have that stuff, you don't talk about it. And even if you're faking it, you don't talk about it. Anyway, there's a lot of that kind of game. So eventually, I've read the pleadings, a lot of them. The lawyer's on their case. And what he says is, the lawyer says, it's now the Mueller's asked for 4 more months, and now he's turning over the case to a U.S. attorney. He said, it's too complicated, we're going to deal with it in the U.S. It's no longer his case, which is really interesting to me. Because he announced it with such great fanfare, you thought he had a lock. And so the company comes in, and in the last pleading they said, literally, one of the arguments was, I'll tell you what this is, the lawyer said. He said, this is, you got a problem, they lost the election, the Democrats say, let's round up the usual suspects. It's that last scene in Casablanca when the colonel says, Major Sasha's been shot, round up the usual suspects. And that was an argument made in the court. You went to round up these, where are the usual suspects? The commies, the Russians. So you round us up, but cases, they just had a hearing Monday, which there was a continuance on. I don't think they're going to make the case because I don't think they can. So one of my smart guys in the American government, very smart guy, does a lot of work for the government, very loyal. He said to me, wow, he said about Mueller, just the guys they indicted were all, the highest guy they got was a deputy director. They hired nobody higher than that. And he said, he sent me an email. He said, they got the names probably out of a GRU directory, which is, you can find. We put a lot of directories online. The reason I went, when I was looking for Calais, I went to Pentagon directories. You can find a lot of stuff. Only in America can you find a CIA guy undercover who's listed by his name in Bethesda. Only. They've stopped doing it, but for years, that's how I used to find agents. If I got a name, I could find him. If it wasn't Smith, I could get the guy. His wife wanted it. They wanted to find out the name of his wife, and then you're in business. Anyway, the point being, so my friend said, wouldn't it be great if one of those 12 guys came in and accepted jurisdiction and said, tell us how you know what you did. It was a study done by, get this, a group of academics working for the NSA in Pittsburgh on that case. I'm just telling you, go Google The Intercept, Winters, what's her name? And then read it. They published a 5-page document. If that isn't the same case, it's about 12 guys who busted in. It's a year and a half old, and at that time it was discussed as high probability. So I get suspicious. And I don't know what Trump knows or doesn't know. I just don't know because I know he doesn't read. But I will tell you that the smart guys I knew after 9/11, one was Marines are really, really vicious, dumb guys, or very tough, very bright guys. And one of the guys I knew was a 4-star Marine who, he had a command once that had to do, Cuba was in his range, and there was a period in the Clinton administration when we were going nuts because Cubans were leaving by boatload from Cuba, and they were getting close into American waters in Key West, and we didn't know what to do with it. We wanted to tell Castro what to stop, but the White House didn't know how to do it because, you know, you don't want to talk nice to Castro because then the Republicans might get mad at you and you lose Florida. I mean, that's the way they think all the time. And so this general just said to his kid, he said, call my pilot and get the jet ready and call Castro and tell him we're coming down. He went and spent 2 great days with Castro. Told the White House he resolved the problem, and boy, is Castro fun and interesting. This is in 03, 04. And of course, I can tell you this because nobody cares now, but I can tell you they went nuts begging him to never tell anybody they did it because the Republicans would get mad in Florida. The government's nuts. Anyway.
On that note, the government's nuts.
I was just going to say one thing. All the Russians have to do is send one of those 12 to America and say, accept jurisdiction, tell me how you know what you know. And that case is gone. So I don't know what Russia did or didn't do, but it's interesting. Yes?
If in fact Trump won and his team won by playing the race card in middle white America, then how possibly can the Democratic Party change its approach unless it too joins in with the race
Well,
card?
you saw what happened in admittedly, the Bronx ain't America, right? But you saw what happened. And you know that there was great disparagement in the last election. African Americans didn't vote nearly in the numbers they would have in the first term for Obama. They fell off considerably. The Hispanic community has always been a frightened to vote because afraid of going to vote will get them thrown out. You know, even more, be more now. There's a way to combine the African American community, the liberal base that does exist, in the Middle West and everybody, the Hispanic community, which votes very poorly out of fear. There's a way to mobilize people. You saw what happened in, was it in Alabama? Where, you know, they had a lot of African-American athletes won the election. They went down, what's his name, the guy that I love, the former Barkley, yeah, the worst golfer I've ever seen. He was at a golf show. He swings, anyway, it's a lot of fun. But they won the election. I don't think the press paid enough attention to it, but they got it, the percentage went up, and that was so it's not impossible. You could turn the race card on its head. I know you want to go to your disco club, so we got to get out of here, right? We'll do a couple more, and I'm going to be,
over here.
Where's the soil?
Over
Am I
here?
supposed to sign books back there? Am I supposed to? I'll be back there. Somebody can grab me for questions.
Over here?
One more, and then I'll go sign books and come and talk to
With
you.
regard to Kissinger.
What?
With regard to Henry Kissinger, does it frustrate you that all the work you did on that book, that he got away with regard to criminal justice, or are you satisfied that you did everything you could and at least the information's out there?
I wrote a book about Kissinger, besides writing terrible stuff about him in the New York Times, which I used to try and always go crazy about. The Times was very deferential when I joined it in the 70s. Scotty Reston and those people were very deferential to him. Anyway, I used to write stories, and Scotty would come up to me, pat up to me in his slippers and say, if you do this, Si, he says he's going to resign. And I said, I don't think he will. I think he's going to resign and get indicted? Come on. I didn't say that. I just said, I got to do what I got to do. So there was a deference to him. And the year after I did a book called The Price of Power, that was sort of an Hoffman, in a review, Stanley Hoffman described it, the Kissinger anti-memoirs. I sort of went after everything he said in his memoirs. He wouldn't see me, although he used to see me a lot, always off the record. And then I learned many years later that every conversation I had with him off the record by phone, he had a transcript of within 1 hour. I'm not kidding. I mean, he really devious son of a... Anyway. So here's where I came. The year after I did that book, there's something called the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where you bring a guest. Every major group, including my newspaper, wanted him as the guest. So that was really crushing. In other words, he still was most wanted man. So here's what I think. I think now that when I count sleep, I'm entitled to count sheep. When I can't, he has to count burned and maimed Vietnamese and Cambodian babies the rest of his life. So let him do that. So that's the way I rationalize it. He knows what he did. He knows that he can't get away from what he did. He killed a lot of people only because he wanted to get close to the president. He knew that war was a non-starter from early I know Mort Halperin and Dan Ellsberg were working with him then. They've all become good friends. Many of the guys who worked for him then, I've gotten to know. And he knew from the beginning there was no way out. You had to get a peace quick. There was no way out. You're not going to defeat a guerrilla army with a bunch of Americans who, and in the end, the thing about that documentary, about which I have a lot of quarrels with, what's the name of the document, the 10-part series? In the end, to find the enemy, we sent Marines. I mean, really, and hardcore guys. The Marines really do it. I mean, they're like the I don't know. I like I could say. I won't. But anyway, they're amazing fighters, and they send them on patrols into enemy territory so they would be ambushed. That's what they were doing. That's what the documentary was telling, which I've known. And then they would be ambushed, and then we'd be able to, once we saw the fire and we get coordinates, then we could drop napalm, trying our best to avoid the guys. And that's how we found the enemy. We send them on, Hezbollah fights the same way, if you want to know the truth, like the Marines. Hezbollah turned the war around for Syria. Syria was fighting like us, standing off and shooting rockets, and they just would go in and die with boots on the ground, they call it. Marines put the boots on the ground. The Army can, but it doesn't often. And so they use the Marines that way, and that it didn't come across enough in the reviews of it. I mean, the war was reduced to just putting boys into murder situations so we could find the enemy, because we had so little intelligence. And how can you explain that war? How can you explain it? How can you explain deciding we're going to do a war against an idea, terror? How can you explain 17 years in Afghanistan? How can you explain it? And so, look out. This guy may end that war. I'll tell you now, there's more talks going on than you know. There's been secret talks going on in a country it would be hard to believe. So there's more talks going on. I don't write about that stuff. I can talk about it, but writing about it is different. There's just more stuff going on than you know. So what do you do? What do you do with the Democrats? Are you loyal to the bad wars that you guys, Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, go back to that war? What do? You got to get a new generation in. And you got to do it. That means you got to commit Harry on the top. And I don't see any drive to do it. That's the answer. That's the simple. And I'll tell you something. If you do, you can beat the guy, because nobody likes a bully. He's a barnyard bully, and he's a posturing bully, but he's not stupid. Stop thinking he's stupid. He learned about what was going on in Mexico, and within 5 hours stopped it. He didn't know it until it hit the newspapers. In fact, the New York Times hadn't done much about it until ProPublica, one of those things, produced a tape recording of a kid crying for his mother. Remember? That broke the story. But it wasn't covered by anybody. It was really missed what's going on down there. And the whole idea that well, anyway, let's go on.
She's coming for you, son. Thank you very much.
Okay.